So I felt like I needed to do this video because there's a wildlife model in this world that everybody seems to gloss over. And that's the South African wildlife management model. I think it's probably equal to the North American wildlife model. It's very distinctly different, but equally great in terms of its conservation success story over time. The South African wildlife model is very unique because it is focused on the private ownership, the private land stewardship of wildlife. Through an act in 1991 called the Game Theft Act, owners of land that had adequate enclosure, i.e. a fence, could own the wildlife within that fence. Belongs to you. You can do whatever you want with it. You can sell it. You can sell it from an ecotourism perspective. You can sell it from a hunting perspective. You can sell it from a meat perspective. That animal belongs to you. You are the ultimate steward of that wildlife. Now, that is completely contrary to the North American wildlife model, which is based on public resource, public doctrine. The animals itself belong to the people, belong to the state. And the state stewards those resources on behalf of the constituents of those states. Migratory species belong to the feds. The feds have jurisdiction over those species. Both the North American wildlife model as well as the South African wildlife model are bastions of wildlife conservation success stories all around the world. You hear the North American lauded on platforms all over the world, in policy houses and legislation, talking about how great a model it is. You do not hear about the wildlife model of South Africa in those same chambers, in those same meetings, being talked about the same way as the North American model. And I wonder why. Why hasn't somebody championed the South African wildlife model? The South African wildlife model has clear evidence of its success. The success is driven by value. You put more value on wildlife, allow the private landowner to generate funds from that value. Yes, I said funds, i.e. money, i.e. economic gain, because that is what the world is driven by. And somebody's going to look at this video and go, oh my God, you're commodifying wildlife. In lots of places in the world, even in North America, the commodification of wildlife drives its conservation. You put value on wildlife, it increases its value, people want more of it around, sustains it over time for our kids and our grandkids one day. That's how it works. That's how it works in South Africa. Rhinos. Private landowners are the majority owners of rhinos in South Africa, 90%. I'm not going to get into the details of how many rhinos have been lost under public protection. The reason being is they see more value for rhinos, sustainable use, rhino hunting, ecotourism, under the private land model in South Africa. It's a simple model. In the 60s, 70s, you had almost 500,000 head of wildlife in South Africa. Today, estimates range from 20 to 26 million. I know that's a big range because nobody can really put a thumb on what the actual numbers are. But you don't really need an actual number. All you need to know is that it's gone from very little wildlife to a lot of wildlife. And how did that happen? It happened because of sustainable use of that wildlife. Hunting primarily drove a lot of those numbers. Yes, lots of ecotourism, nature reserves occurring in South Africa. And yes, game ranching, wildlife management, breeding animals, moving animals, all led to this massive number. But without the sustainable use and without the hunting, that number would be nowhere near the success story that it is today. And unfortunately, there are people in our society that look down their nose at an essential tool in the wildlife management model for South Africa. The evidence is absolutely crystal clear. It works. Granted, I understand you do not like hunting. You do not like animals being killed. You would prefer an animal to starve to death at an old age. I get it. But you cannot deny the benefits that have come from sustainable use of wildlife, including hunting, in South Africa to get it to where it is today from a wildlife conservation model. You can't deny it. Facts are facts. There's no opinions in this matter. You got to remember, this recovery, again, I'm going to say something that I've said before, this recovery was driven by economics. Economics drive whether wildlife exists or it doesn't exist. Economics drives whether or not you've got more wildlife or less wildlife. Economics drive the photographic opportunities of that animal. Economics drive the hunting opportunities of that animal. Economics drive everything. The critical point today in continuing the wildlife conservation success model in South Africa is the ability to export these species, specifically from a trade perspective on sustainable use of elephants, black rhinos, and leopards. Those animals all require value. Elephants You can't give an elephant away for free anymore in South Africa. People are looking to value their elephants. Hunting is a mechanism by which you can value it. Same with black rhinos, same with leopards. Leopards, even more importantly, taking it from a vilified predator of livestock and your game to a value add to what you have on your property, to a commodified, valued product. I know, you hate hearing me say that, but it's the truth. Since 2021, the South African government has failed to issue a quota for elephants, black rhino, and leopard because of court proceedings from 2021 through to today. Those quotas are essential and would act as a multiplier of value add to wildlife in South Africa, specifically elephants that are being looked at as more of a nuisance and a habitat destroyer today versus the habitat change makers that people are looking for at smaller population densities on their specific game reserves. So I'll end it like this. The lack of people talking about the South African wildlife model, the lack of quota, the economic value of wildlife raises a very simplistic question. Why would anybody believe that removing a legal value associated with wildlife on private lands, i.e. hunting, i.e. sustainable use of that wildlife, why would anybody want to remove it when the conservation success, the conservation evidence of that tool is clear as day? Look, the South African wildlife model isn't perfect. I get it. No wildlife model in the world is. And no proposed wildlife model is either. But the model is functional, the model is resilient, and the model has proven by evidence that it works. The regulatory hesitation that's occurring at the South African government level for issuing export quotas is not incentivizing wildlife conservation. It's actually eroding the very incentives that have brought us to this point in time. Remember, conservation does not fail because people don't care about wildlife. It fails when wildlife stops paying its own way. Prior to the 1970s, livestock paid its way on the land. After 1970, landowners, game reserves realized that wildlife pays its own way. South Africa learned this lesson decades ago. The question now is whether we're willing to remember it and push it forward over the next decade to enhance wildlife conservation even more in South Africa.